When Caleb Turner married the preacher's daughter, folks called it a blessing. But 3 weeks later, he started digging. And what he uncovered in the dirt beneath his barn wasn't just a body. It was a lie the whole town helped bury. They said it was the prettiest wedding Dust Hollow had seen in 20 years, the kind where sunlight broke perfectly through the clouds, where even the crows held their breath, where flowers bloomed early just to witness it. Caleb Turner stood under the chapel oak, tall, quiet, boots freshly shined, hat pressed to his chest. The man barely smiled, but when he saw Clara May, he did. She floated down the aisle in a soft cream dress with a bouquet of prairie lilies and a lace veil borrowed from her late mother. The whole town rose to watch, not a single whisper in the air. Even the preacher, her own father, got misty-eyed when he gave her away. Clara didn't cry. She smiled like she was made for this moment, like it was sewn into her skin. But she never let go of her gloves. White satin, elbow length, fitted perfectly to her hands. It was nearly 90 degrees that day. People noticed, but no one dared ask. Not when she was the preacher's daughter, not when it was Caleb Turner, the most dependable man this side of the Dry Valley. If he was marrying her, she had to be good. She had to be. They were the picture of Dust Hollow's hope. A rancher with deep roots and a girl raised on hymns. Folks said God himself must have smiled on them that day. But if he did, he kept the thunder rumbling just past the hills. The reception was simple, just like they'd wanted. Tables on the church lawn, sweet tea in mason jars, and Clara's cousin Mary playing fiddle beneath the hanging lights. Caleb barely spoke, but Clara danced. She twirled with the children, hugged the old women, and kissed her husband's cheek every time someone passed with a camera. But once the music faded, and the guests drove off in dusty wagons, something in her changed. They rode home in silence. The wind carried the first scent of nightfall, dry hay, distant smoke, and the faint sweetness of apple blossoms from the orchard. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder in the wagon, but her eyes stayed open, watching, listening. She didn't speak until they reached the house. "I'd like to sleep in the barn tonight," she said softly. Caleb chuckled, thinking she was joking. "You want your wedding night with the horses?" Her eyes didn't blink. "I feel safer there." He hesitated, then nodded. Maybe it was nerves. Maybe she just missed her mother. Maybe it was nothing at all. He helped her down, kissed her hand, and watched her walk barefoot across the yard, satin gloves still on, disappearing into the barn without another word. That night, Caleb lay awake in their bed, alone, staring at the ceiling. He could hear the barn door creak shut, then silence, then humming. Faint and far off, but clear. A slow, strange lullaby. It didn't match the songs they had played at the wedding. And though the window was open, he couldn't remember a breeze ever sounding that cold. The barn became hers. Every night after the wedding, Clara slipped from the house and curled up in the loft, like the bedroom they had made together didn't fit her skin right. Caleb tried not to question it. Not at first. She'd say she needed the fresh air, that the stars helped her sleep, that the scent of the horses reminded her of home. But her home was a preacher's cottage, clean, prim, and nowhere near a barn. He knew something was wrong when she stopped coming back inside before dawn. And when she started humming, even in her sleep, it was always the same melody, low and slow, like a funeral dirge disguised as a lullaby. Caleb couldn't place the tune, but it clung to his bones like cold fog. The third night he lay awake listening. The barn was just visible through the open bedroom window. Lantern light flickered behind the loft slats. Shadows moved, not fast, not loud, just enough to make his scalp prickle. Then he heard it. A voice, soft, broken, a whisper through the night air. At first he thought it was the wind slipping between the barn boards, but wind didn't say names. And this whisper, it said his. Caleb. Once, then again, drawn out. Not desperate, familiar, like someone who'd known him for years, someone who knew how he'd react. He sat up, heart thudding against his ribs. There was no way Clara could have called him like that. The voice didn't match her tone. This one was raspy, tired, and thick with something heavy. Grief, hate. He rose quietly, grabbed the lantern from the nightstand, and made his way outside barefoot. The night air bit hard. As he neared the barn, the humming stopped. So did the whisper. He opened the door slowly. It creaked just loud enough to feel like a warning. "Clara," he called out. No answer, just hay rustling above. He climbed the ladder to the loft, one step at a time. Clara lay curled beneath a quilt, face pale in the lamplight, hair tousled across her cheek. She looked peaceful, too peaceful. "Did you say something?" he asked. Her eyes opened slowly, but there was no surprise in them. "No," she said, "but she does." "She who?" Clara sat up, not blinking. "The girl in the boards." Caleb's skin went cold. "What girl?" Clara didn't answer. She laid back down and turned away. "Clara." He stepped closer. "I was only supposed to watch her," she mumbled. Her voice was fading again, like she was slipping into sleep or something deeper. "But the preacher said I had to forget." The next morning, Clara acted like nothing had happened. She served breakfast, talked about mending the fence, asked Caleb how many horses he planned to trade at next week's fair. He stared at her across the table, hands unmoving. "You remember last night?" he finally asked. She blinked. "Of course. I slept like a baby." "You said something about a girl in the boards." Clara frowned, almost confused. Then she smiled. "I must have been dreaming." But when she reached for her coffee, he saw it. A long, fresh scratch across her wrist, just below the glove line. By the end of the first week, Caleb had stopped asking questions out loud. Clara moved like she belonged to a different time, one that drifted just past the edge of reality, like heat waves over a prairie trail. She'd hum that same tune at the stove, fold laundry that wasn't theirs. Once she left a dinner plate on the table across from them, then stared at it like she was waiting for someone. Caleb kept busy with the herd, with fence posts, with anything that grounded him. But the more he worked, the more the house, and especially the barn, began to feel like a trap. And then came the day the beam cracked. He'd gone up to the loft to patch a split rafter above the hay pile. Clara wasn't there, but he could still smell the faint trail of her perfume, the lavender kind she wore on their wedding day. Dust hung thick in the sunlight, streaming through the loft slats. He pushed some hay aside to make room to work. That's when he heard it. A soft crack, not from the rafter, but the wall. A loose board, not nailed flush like the rest. Curious, Caleb tugged it gently. It shifted with little effort. Behind it sat a tiny gap, dark and still, about the width of a shoebox. Inside, something was tucked between the slats. A folded sheet of paper, old and yellowed, edges curled like it had been hidden for years. He opened it slowly, the fibers soft and brittle. It was a page torn from a hymnal. Blessed Assurance was printed at the top, but someone had written over the music in pencil. It was a map, roughly drawn with shaky lines and no words. Just a sketch of the barn's outline and a small X marked near the far corner, beneath the loft. Next to the X, a single word was scrolled in faded graphite. Me. Caleb stared at it, unsure if he was supposed to be scared or ashamed for not finding it sooner. He climbed down, boots echoing against the loft ladder, and walked straight to the marked corner. The ground there was packed tighter than elsewhere. No hoofprints, no tools, just dirt that hadn't been disturbed in a long while. His hands itched. He looked back toward the house. The kitchen curtains fluttered, but Clara wasn't there. He dropped to his knees. There was no shovel. He used his bare hands. Each scrape of his fingers pulled back years of soil. The dirt felt colder here, wetter, as if something down below had preserved the memory of rain long after the prairie dried out. 4 inches down, his fingers hit wood. Not a support beam. A box, rough-hewn with uneven edges, nailed shut. The kind of thing someone builds in a hurry, not to keep something in, but to hide it away. He sat back on his heels, chest rising hard. Then a sound behind him. He spun around. Clara stood at the barn door. No gloves this time. Her fingers, pale, scarred, and trembling, gripped the frame like it might crumble in her hands. "You weren't supposed to find that," she said softly. Caleb stood, dust clinging to his palms. "What is it?" She didn't answer, just stared at the box. Her lips moved, but no words came. Then she turned and walked away. Not in panic, not in shame, just slowly, like she knew he would follow, or that he wouldn't. And somehow both outcomes suited her just fine. The sun was almost gone when Caleb returned to the barn. He hadn't seen Clara again since she walked away. She didn't come to supper, didn't light the lamp in the kitchen window like she usually did. The house stood still and silent, like it was holding its breath. But the barn still breathed. He stood in that far corner a long while, staring at the wooden box buried beneath the dirt, its corners now fully exposed. He hadn't opened it earlier, couldn't. Something about it felt like a wound, and to open it would be to make it bleed. But now, beneath a sky bruised with nightfall, he knew it was time. He fetched a crowbar from the tool shed and returned, lantern in hand. Its flame flickered low, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts trapped in old timber. Kneeling, he wedged the iron under the edge of the lid and pried gently. The wood groaned, dry, reluctant. It cracked open. Inside, folded neatly like it had just been placed there, was a wedding dress. Cream-colored, with lace sleeves. A small stain, brown and ghost-like, marked the hem. Caleb didn't breathe. He lifted the dress slowly, his fingers shaking. Beneath it lay bones. Small, delicate, curled like someone had been laid down carefully, or had died in pain. He staggered backward, his hand covering his mouth. The air turned thick, heavy with rot and memory. He dropped to his knees again, overcome by a wave of something he couldn't name. Horror, disbelief, betrayal. And then he saw the note. It was tucked into the folds of the dress, yellowed and brittle, written in faint ink that bled at the edges. He pulled it free with trembling fingers and brought it closer to the lantern. One sentence, scratched in a rushed, panicked hand. "I never said I do." He sat frozen, the words cutting through the air like a knife. The wind outside picked up, whistling through the slats. Behind him, a footstep. Caleb turned. Clara stood just inside the barn, still in her plain dress, hair down, eyes wide and distant. She looked not surprised, but tired, like she'd been waiting for this night, for this moment. He rose to his feet, holding the note loosely in one hand. "Whose bones are these?" he asked, his voice low and raw. She looked past him to the box, then whispered, "Mine." Caleb blinked. "Clara." "No." Her voice was firmer now. "Her name was Anna. She was the preacher's daughter, the first one." "What?" Clara stepped forward, the lantern light catching her face, just enough to show tears brimming in her eyes. "They said she ran away, that she broke his heart, but he never let her leave. He buried her here, and then gave me her name." She paused. "I was just supposed to play the part." Caleb stood still, the ground beneath him suddenly unstable, like the entire barn might give way under the weight of her truth. "But you," he started. She looked at him with something almost like sorrow. "I didn't marry you. She did. At least, that's what the preacher told himself." Outside, thunder rolled low on the horizon. Inside, the barn held its silence like a prayer, and Caleb realized he didn't know who he'd brought home. The storm rolled closer that night. Caleb didn't sleep. He sat at the edge of the bed, boots still on, hands still stained with dirt. The wedding dress, the one from the box, lay draped over a chair like a ghost made of lace. Clara had gone to bed without another word, not to the barn this time. She went to their room, undressed in silence, and slipped under the quilt like she'd done it every night for years. Caleb couldn't lie beside her, not after what she'd said. He watched her from the corner of the room, watched the way her chest rose and fell, peaceful, controlled, like someone who had long ago made peace with the dead. The next morning, she was gone. Not gone from the house, just absent, as if her body moved, but the rest of her hadn't returned from whatever place her confession had taken her. Caleb ate alone, fed the horses, checked the fence line, but the air was different now, too still. It clung to his neck like a warning. When he returned to the barn, the box was gone. The dirt where it had lain was freshly turned, and the lantern had been snuffed out. He called her name, softly at first, then louder. No answer. Then he checked the root cellar. The door was open. Caleb descended the creaking wooden stairs, lantern in hand. The cellar was cool, damp, lined with preserved jars, sacks of grain, and a scent that hadn't been there before. Earthy, but wrong. He crouched low and followed the smell to the back wall. There, hidden behind old apple crates, was a false panel. He pulled it aside. A narrow tunnel stretched into the dark, barely shoulder width. Carved into the dirt above the entrance, scratched by a fingernail or a knife, was a name. Laya. Not Anna, not Clara. Laya. The name pulsed in his skull like a bell struck too many times. He dropped to his knees and crawled inside. The tunnel was shallow, just enough room to move. The walls were lined with rotted wood and dried moss. Scratches clawed into the dirt on both sides. Desperate, overlapping, human. After 10 feet, the space widened. A hidden room, no more than 6 feet across. Inside, Caleb found chains, rusty and coiled, a broken comb, a small pair of shoes, one missing its heel, and another hymnal page nailed to the wall. The words were blacked out in charcoal, all except one verse. "Let the dead bury their dead." His stomach turned. This wasn't Clara's hiding place. This was her origin. When Caleb emerged from the tunnel, Clara stood waiting at the top of the cellar steps. Her hands were bare now. The gloves were gone. So were the tears. She looked at him with eyes that had stopped pretending. "She was my sister," Clara said quietly. He locked her down there when she refused to marry the man he'd chosen. Said she disobeyed the word of God. "And the bones?" Caleb asked, his voice dry. Clara looked away. She tried to run once, dug through the wall, made it to the barn. He caught her. Her voice broke. "He made me forget." Thunder cracked above them. Caleb stepped closer, his voice rising. "What the hell kind of preacher?" "He's still a preacher," she said coldly. "Still says grace over Sunday dinner. Still shakes hands after every sermon." Her eyes narrowed. "But I remember now." Outside, the wind picked up, dragging dust across the fields. Inside, the last light of morning stretched across the cellar doorway. Caleb stood staring at Clara, unsure of who she truly was. Sister, survivor, witness, or something else entirely. But one thing had become clear. He hadn't just married the preacher's daughter. He had married the silence that man had built, and silence, once buried, never stays buried for long. The storm broke at noon. Rain came hard and fast, washing over Dust Hollow like it had something to cleanse. But Caleb didn't go inside. He sat on the porch, soaked to the skin, Clara's words repeating in his head like a cracked photograph. He's still a preacher, still standing at the pulpit every Sunday, still handing out blessings with blood beneath his nails. That night in the barn, digging through bones and lace, Caleb had believed the horror was buried, that it belonged to the past. But now he saw it. Alive, walking, preaching, praised. And Clara had lived with it, grown up in it, been shaped by it. She hadn't run. She'd waited. By sundown she brought him a letter, folded once, edges crisp, ink still drying. "I wrote this for the sheriff," she said, setting it gently on his lap. "You can deliver it, if you believe me." Caleb looked at the envelope. The front read, "Sheriff Dunley, personal." He opened it slowly, eyes scanning every line Clara had written by hand. Her penmanship was neat, practiced, the kind learned in a church school by girls who were taught never to raise their voices. But her words shouted. She described it all: the tunnel, the false name, the hymnal pages, the sister buried in the barn, the locked room, the preacher's wrath dressed in holy robes. She ended it with 4 words. "He made me disappear." Caleb looked up at her. "Why now?" Clara sat beside him barefoot, her dress wet at the hem from the rain. She didn't cry, not anymore. "Because I finally remember," she said, "and because you stayed." He wanted to speak, to ask how many others had vanished, how many secrets had been stitched into pew cushions and Sunday sermons. But instead, he just said, "I'll take it to him. First light." Clara nodded, and for a moment, just one, the silence between them felt less like something buried and more like something shared. At dawn, Caleb rode into town. The trail was wet and slick, but his hands were steady. The letter was tucked in his coat pocket, the weight of it somehow heavier than any rifle he'd carried. Dust Hollow looked the same. The church bell rang. Shopkeepers opened shutters. A woman waved as he passed, and there, on the chapel steps, stood Preacher Mathers, smiling, greeting people, forgiven by a town that never asked what needed forgiving. Caleb dismounted, walked straight past him, didn't say a word. The preacher's smile faltered just slightly. "Brother Turner," he called. "Ain't like you to pass a man without a handshake." Caleb stopped, turned halfway. "No," he said, his voice low. "It ain't." Then he kept walking. Inside the sheriff's office, the floor creaked under his boots. Sheriff Dunley looked up from his desk, pipe still in hand, newspaper folded in his lap. "Something on your mind, Caleb?" Caleb reached into his coat, pulled out the letter, and set it gently on the desk. Dunley eyed it. "What's this?" "A name you've forgotten," Caleb said, "and one you never knew." Dust Hollow had always prided itself on silence, not the peaceful kind, the other kind, the kind built by shared glances, unspoken rules, and the weight of tradition pressing down on anyone who asked too many questions. That silence was louder than any sermon, and Caleb Turner had just broken it. Word traveled faster than wagons ever could. By nightfall, everyone in town knew Caleb had handed something to the sheriff. Something sealed, something from Clara. The postmaster said he saw Dunley's hand tremble when he opened it. The widow who swept the church steps said the preacher had stopped mid-sermon that Sunday, looked out the chapel window, and gone quiet for a full minute. But no one spoke of the girl, not by name, not in public. They spoke around her, like she was wind or stormlight, or a sin they couldn't quite forget. Caleb stayed close to the ranch. He kept to the fences, hammering boards that didn't need fixing. Clara barely spoke, but when she passed him his tools, her hands no longer shook. They'd shared something now. Not love, maybe not yet, but memory. And in Dust Hollow, that was more dangerous than anything. Then, 3 nights later, someone rode out to the ranch. Fast, hard. Caleb stepped onto the porch with his rifle as the horse thundered toward him. It was Sheriff Dunley. He dismounted in a cloud of dust, hat crooked, coat unbuttoned. "You need to come with me," he said, his breath sharp. "Now." "What is it?" Dunley hesitated, glanced toward the barn, then back at Caleb. "He's gone." Caleb didn't have to ask who. Preacher Mathers had disappeared sometime before sunrise. His bed was made. His horse was still in the stable. His Bible was left open to a page most folks never read. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed. The sheriff's office was quiet when Caleb arrived. A few deputies stood near the jailhouse wall, whispering. Clara's letter sat open on the desk, stained with fresh fingerprints. "You believe her now?" Caleb asked. Dunley nodded once. "I think I always did." "Then why didn't you act?" The sheriff looked out the window at the church steeple. "Because men like him hide in places we want to believe are pure." That night the town changed, not loudly, not all at once. The chapel was locked. The hymns stopped. A few families packed their wagons, saying nothing, leaving behind houses they had called home for generations. Others stayed, but they walked a little slower, kept their heads lower. And the silence, the one that had protected the preacher, that had swallowed Leah, that had nearly buried Clara, finally cracked. At the ranch, Clara sat in the barn loft again, but this time she wasn't alone. Caleb climbed up beside her, bringing 2 mugs of coffee and the letter she'd written. He handed it back to her. "Keep it," he said, "just in case they try to forget again." Clara smiled softly. "I won't let them." They didn't put her name on the grave. No one could agree on which one it should be. Was it Anna, the name her mother gave her? Was it Clara, the one the preacher forced on her sister? Or was it Leah, the name scratched into the cellar wall with bleeding fingers? They didn't know, so they wrote nothing. Just a stone, just silence, just shame dressed up as closure. The whole town showed up, even those who claimed they had no part in it. Even those who had dined with Preacher Mathers every Sunday. Caleb stood beside Clara under a gray sky, his hat pressed to his chest. He watched the coffin descend into the earth with no priest, no scripture, no choir. Just the wind and the creak of rope over pine. Someone had brought flowers, wild ones, picked from the edge of the Dust Creek Trail. No one claimed them. Clara reached down and placed a single glove on the coffin before it vanished beneath the dirt. The last piece of the lie they'd all lived. After the burial, people lingered like they wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Caleb heard murmurs. "She was just a girl. Couldn't have known. We trusted the preacher." But they did know. At least part of them did. You don't bury a child's screams behind a hymnal wall unless you've trained yourself not to hear. The sheriff approached Caleb as the townsfolk began to scatter. "She wants to testify," he said, nodding toward Clara. Caleb looked over. She was standing alone now, arms crossed, face unreadable. "She should," Caleb said. "They all should hear it." The sheriff nodded, then added, "It won't fix everything." "It ain't meant to," Caleb replied. "It's meant to stop it from happening again." Later that night, Clara stood in the doorway of the barn, the same one she used to hide inside. She wasn't humming. She wasn't afraid. She held the hymnal pages in her hands, edges torn, words crossed out, names scribbled in margins. She dropped them into the lantern flame, one by one. They curled into ash, not out of hate, but freedom. Some things don't deserve to be kept, not even as memory. In the loft, Caleb unrolled a new journal. He wrote the name Laya at the top. Then, in slow, careful handwriting, he began to tell the truth. Not as a tale, not as a warning, but as a record. So when the next preacher came, and the next girl wore gloves in summer, someone would remember. They didn't have a second wedding. They didn't need one. No flowers, no preacher, no veil. Just a promise, spoken at the edge of the barn one evening, as the sun sank like a lantern behind the hills. Clara took his hand. "I'm not her," she said. "I know," he said. "I wouldn't love you if you were." The church doors hadn't opened in weeks, not since the preacher vanished. Dust settled on the pews. Bibles curled at the edges. The bell rope hung limp, like a noose left waiting. Most folks walked past the chapel now without looking up, like it had become a grave they couldn't name. But someone had unlocked the doors. One Sunday morning, with no announcement, no flyers, no notice, they stood wide open. Every oil lamp was lit. Candles flickered in every window. It was as if the church was breathing again. But not like before. This time it had a different voice. Clara stood at the front of the sanctuary, hands folded in front of her. Not behind the pulpit. In front of it, level with the people. The light caught her hair, now loosely braided, and the dark bruise of memory behind her eyes. The pews were half full. Word had spread. No one knew exactly what was about to happen, but they knew it was her speaking, and that was reason enough to come. Caleb sat in the back, hat low, rifle resting by his side. Not in threat, in promise, that this time the girl would not be interrupted. Clara stepped forward. She didn't speak like her father used to. No fire, no thunder, just a voice as steady as a still pond and sharper than glass beneath it. "Some of you remember the girl who wore gloves in summer." She paused. A few heads turned downward. "Some of you knew she didn't smile the same way her sister did, that she looked out windows instead of into people's eyes." Another pause. The air grew heavier. "Some of you knew more. You saw the bruises, heard the humming, noticed when the hymnal pages were torn out, and never asked why." A woman in the second row began to cry. "The man who raised me told you to look away, and you did, every Sunday for years." She walked slowly along the aisle. "But I'm here to tell you, the preacher's last sermon has already been delivered. You just didn't listen to it." Clara stopped at the pulpit, placed her bare hand on the old leather Bible, and looked directly into the crowd. It was written in bones and buried in my barn. No one clapped, no one spoke. They just sat there, as if her words had nailed them to the floor. Some wept, some stared. One man stood and walked out, unable to bear it. Caleb watched her from the back, his jaw clenched. She wasn't just telling a story. She was undoing a curse. When it was done, she didn't bow her head. She didn't say, "Amen." She turned, walked out the same door she'd entered, and Dust Hollow never heard a louder silence. That night, someone broke the pulpit into pieces and left it on the chapel steps. No one claimed the act. No one needed to. The church never reopened. But the town, it started breathing again, for the first time in decades. Spring came late that year. The frost held longer than it should have. Snow clung to the edges of fence posts. The creek refused to thaw until Easter Sunday. It was as if Dust Hollow had to fight to earn its bloom, but when the thaw finally came, it came with wildflowers. Fields full of them. Yellow, purple, white, blooming like the land had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Clara stood at the edge of the pasture, boots muddy, dress caught in the wind. She watched the colts run wild under the new sun, kicking and bucking like they knew they'd never be chained. Caleb joined her without a word. They didn't speak much in the mornings now, not because of grief, but because peace had taken its place. The barn was rebuilt, not from the ground up, but from the bones of what had stood before. The loft stayed, so did the beams. But the corner where the box had been, that dirt had been left untouched, planted with prairie grass and a single white lily. No marker, no stone, just space. Let the dead bury their dead, the hymn had said. But the living, make room. One morning, Clara woke before dawn. She took a can of red paint and walked to the front gate of the ranch. The old sign read, Turner Ranch, carved into a rough pine plank hanging crooked from rusted chains. She didn't take it down. She just painted a new name beneath it. Slow, careful, with the same handwriting she'd used to write that letter to the sheriff. Lia's Hope. She stepped back and looked at it, lips pressed in a line. Caleb came out of the barn with coffee, saw her, and smiled. "Looks good," he said. "Looks right," she replied. He handed her the mug. They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun rise behind their new name. In town, the church was torn down. The wood was repurposed for a schoolhouse. The bell was melted down into horseshoes. And in the town square, a plaque was placed. Not large, not loud, but enough. In memory of the girl they tried to forget, and the woman who made us remember. Clara never spoke of her father again. She didn't have to. She wrote stories now, quiet ones. Stories with no heroes, just truth. About sisters, about silence, about barns that hold more than hay. Caleb helped her bind them, in leather covers stitched by hand. He said they were more valuable than gold. They didn't sell the ranch. They opened it. They took in girls with no homes, gave them horses to ride, fields to run in, books to read, and names that were theirs and theirs alone. They taught them to plant lilies and to never wear gloves unless they chose to. Years later, long after the preacher's name faded from memory, someone asked Clara what her story had really been about. She looked across the field at the horses running free, then said, "Not about who buried me." She turned to them and smiled. "It's about who helped me dig. If you believe that some secrets should never stay buried, and that one voice can change a whole town, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. Let us know in the comments what you think the preacher's fate should have been. Thanks for listening.